The morning sun was rising over the Navy SEAL training compound. The ground was already alive with the sound of boots hitting the dirt, orders being shouted, and recruits pushing themselves through another brutal day. Most of the young men were strong, loud, and full of energy. They were eager to prove themselves, eager to show that they belonged in one of the toughest training programs in the world. Then, in the middle of all that noise and energy, he appeared an old man. He walked. Slowly, his steps measured, his body lean but clearly aged. His skin was dark, his face lined with years of life and struggle. His eyes, though calm, carried something that most of the recruits could not understand. He said nothing. He simply walked into the compound as though he belonged there. The moment the recruits saw him, whispers started to spread. Some stopped their push-ups to watch him. Others nudged their friends and chuckled. "Who's that? Is he lost?" One young man whispered. Another laughed. "Maybe he's here to clean the place." The sight of someone so old in a place built for youth and strength seemed like a joke. The instructors didn't say much. They simply allowed the man to stand among the recruits as if he had every right to be there. This confused the younger men even more. Why wasn't anyone asking him to leave? Why wasn't anyone telling him he was too old? The old man carried no loud presence. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't puff out his chest like the younger men. He didn't boast, didn't shout. He just stood quietly, watching, his hands behind his back, his lips sealed. His silence felt heavy, almost strange in a place where everyone else was trying so hard to be noticed. Some recruits mocked him openly. "Hey, Grandpa, you lost the retirement home." One shouted, earning laughs from his group. Another added, "Careful, don't break your hip during drills." They laughed louder, waiting for the old man to react. But he didn't. His eyes stayed calm, his face unbothered. He didn't answer, didn't even glance at them. That silence bothered the recruits more than any comeback could have. They wanted a reaction, but he gave them none. He just stood there as though their words were nothing. And that only made them laugh harder. Yet there was something about him that made a few of the smarter recruits hesitate. His movements, though slow, were steady. He didn't shuffle like an old man who was weak. His posture was straight, his shoulders firm, as if discipline was carved into his bones. His silence wasn't the silence of fear, it was something else, though no one could quite name it. As training resumed, the recruits threw glances at him again and again. Some thought maybe he was just a guest watching the drills. Others believed he was there by mistake. A few even wondered if the instructors were playing a cruel joke on them. But the man did not leave. He lined up with them, ready to endure whatever came next. The air was filled with the sound of heavy breaths, shouts, and commands. But the old man remained wordless. He blended into the background, yet there was an invisible weight around him, a quiet presence that no one could explain. He carried no badge, no uniform like the rest. Yet somehow it seemed as if he had already worn them long before any of these recruits were born. A peckle of recruits grew bold and whispered among themselves. "Maybe he's some kind of test," one said. "Like the instructors are seeing how we treat him." The other scoffed. "No way. He's just too old. Look at him, he doesn't belong here." But as the old man continued walking, each step steady and sure, doubts began to creep into a few hearts. He wasn't just some lost stranger. There was something different about him. Something that didn't match his frail appearance. Still, the louder voices of ridicule drowned out the quieter voices of curiosity. Most of the recruits decided to dismiss him as a useless old man who would probably collapse before the day ended. They laughed, they joked, and they ignored him when it was time to push through their exercises. But the old man didn't collapse. He didn't even stumble. He simply continued, step after step, quiet as ever. And though he had not spoken a single word, though he had not shown a single sign of aggression, something about his presence unsettled them. They just didn't realize why yet. What none of them knew was that this silent figure carried stories on his skin. Stories inked into him. Long ago, stories that would silence every laugh, every cruel whisper, and every mocking word. But for now, he remained the stranger in their midst, the black, silent old man who had arrived without warning, who stood among them without explanation, and who endured their ridicule without a single word. And it was only the beginning. The first day the old man appeared, the recruits were only curious. They laughed a little, whispered a little, but most believed he would disappear after a few hours. Surely, someone that old could not survive Navy SEAL training, they thought. Yet the next morning, when the whistle blew and the recruits stumbled out of their bunks, there he was again. He stood silently at the edge of the training field, dressed in the same simple clothes. His hands behind his back, his face calm and unreadable. He did not chatter with anyone, did not look for attention. He simply stood in line with the rest of them. That was when the real mockery began. Young men, full of pride and arrogance, often see silence as weakness. The recruits, already exhausted from endless push-ups and long runs, found entertainment in targeting the old man. "Hey, Grandpa," one sneered loudly while stretching before drills. "Don't forget to take your medicine before we start." His friends burst into laughter. Another pointed to the man's gray hair and wrinkled skin. "You sure you belong here? This isn't bingo night. This is SEAL training. You're going to break in half before breakfast." The old man heard every word, but as always, he gave no reaction. He didn't look up, didn't argue, didn't smile, didn't even frown. He was like stone, unshaken by the noise around him. This only fueled the recruits further. They started to compete with one another, each trying to invent sharper jokes, crueler lines, just to see if the old man would finally respond. "Careful, someone get this guy a cane," one recruit shouted as they began running drills. Another added, "Hope the nursing home knows he escaped." The laughter echoed louder than the drill instructor's whistle. But the old man's silence remained. He ran when they ran, lifted when they lifted, crawled when they crawled. His pace was slow, but he never stopped. His arms shook with strain during push-ups, but he finished every single one. His breaths were heavy, but he did not fall behind. Some recruits began to feel uneasy watching this. They mocked him, yes, but deep inside, they started asking themselves questions. How was this man clearly decades older than them still keeping up? Why hadn't he quit? Why didn't he defend himself? Still, pride often blinds the young. And so, they covered their doubts with more laughter. "Look at him sweating already," one scoffed. "Bet he won't make it to lunch." But the old man did make it to lunch. Then he made it through the afternoon. By evening, when others were collapsing with cramps and exhaustion, the old man quietly sat alone, eating his simple meal in silence. He didn't celebrate his survival. He didn't act proud. He just existed quiet, steady, unshaken. On the third day, the jokes grew crueler. Some recruits began to push his limits. When they ran laps, a few deliberately ran close, bumping his shoulders, hoping to knock him off balance. He stumbled, but he never fell. Others dropped snide comments during water breaks. "Shouldn't you be telling bedtime stories to your grandkids instead of being here?" The instructors watched, but said nothing. Their eyes followed the old man with curiosity, but their lips stayed sealed. They gave no explanation, no clue as to why he was there. It was as though they were waiting for the recruits to learn something on their own. The laughter became a daily habit. The old man was their entertainment in the midst of suffering. But the more they mocked, the stranger it felt. Because no matter how sharp their words, No matter how cruel their laughter, nothing moved him. Not a single word escaped his lips. Not a flicker of anger touched his face. He simply carried on, and slowly, that silence started to disturb them. It is one thing to laugh at a man who fights back. 'Tis easy to insult someone who loses his temper. But to pour ridicule on a man who never reacts, who never lowers himself to answer back, that is different. It creates doubt. It makes the mocker feel smaller, though they do not admit it. By the end of the week, the recruits began to whisper. When the old man wasn't near, "Who is he really?" some asked. "Why hasn't he quit?" Others laughed it off. "He's nothing. Just an old fool trying to act tough." But the unease was there, growing quietly in the corners of their minds. One night, as the recruits lay in their bunks, sore and exhausted, one of them turned to the others and asked, "Did you notice how he doesn't talk?" "Not once." "Doesn't? It feels strange." His bunkmate laughed nervously. "Yeah, it's like he's a ghost or something." The truth was, the silence of the old man was beginning to feel heavier than their own words. It was as if he was carrying something far greater than all of them understood. But still, they mocked. They continued because pride wouldn't let them stop. They didn't yet know that their laughter would soon turn into shock. They didn't know that hidden beneath the wrinkles and silence of that old man was a story carved into his very skin. A story that no joke could erase. A story that would silence every single voice at the compound once it was revealed. For now, he was still just the black, silent old man. The one they ridiculed each day. The one who endured it all without a word. The one who waited patiently for the moment when the truth would finally speak louder than their laughter. And that moment was coming soon. Asterisk. The sun rose again over the SEAL training compound, and as always, the recruits prepared themselves for another day of punishment. Muscles ached, blisters burned, and every breath felt heavier than the last. Training was not meant to build comfort. It was meant to break spirits and expose weakness. Many young men had already begun to doubt themselves. But in the middle of all that doubt and exhaustion, the old man was still there. Day after day, his presence became impossible to ignore. He was not the fastest. He was not the strongest. He did not shine in any drill or exercise. And yet, he never stopped. That was what unsettled the recruits most, his quiet endurance. During the morning runs, the younger men would sprint ahead, eager to prove their speed. They would laugh as the old man started slow, his steps heavy but steady. "He'll drop." Out after the first mile, someone muttered. But mile after mile, the old man kept moving. His pace never changed. He was not fast, but he was constant. When others slowed, gasping for air, clutching their sides, the old man passed them one by one, never rushing, never stumbling. Push-ups were the same. The recruits slammed themselves onto the ground, racing through the count, grunting loudly to show their strength. The old man lowered himself carefully, each push slow and controlled. His arms trembled, his breath grew sharp, but he completed every single repetition. When others collapsed halfway, the instructors shouted their failures for all to hear. But the old man, silent as always, pressed on until the very end. The ridicule never stopped. Look at him shaking like a leaf. One recruit laughed during drills. Another added, "Any second now, his bones will snap." They watched closely, waiting for him to give up. But the old man didn't break. He simply endured, quietly, without complaint. What none of them understood was that his silence was not weakness. It was discipline. His slow pace was not failure. It was control. He was not trying to prove himself to them. He had nothing left to prove. He was only proving something to himself, that he could still endure, even when the world doubted him. During water breaks, the recruits sprawled on the ground, panting, gulping down water like starving animals. The old man, drenched in sweat, drank slowly and sparingly. He sat alone, his gaze fixed far away, as if he saw something the others could not. He looked like a man carrying memories instead of burdens, a man who had already survived worse than this training could ever bring. By the end of the second week, the recruits' laughter began to sound hollow. They mocked him still, but in their hearts, questions began to grow. How was he still standing? Why hadn't he quit? Some of the younger men who had once ridiculed him now avoided his eyes. His endurance made them uncomfortable. They were strong. They were young, but some of them had already considered dropping out. And yet this old man, whom they thought could not last a single day, was still here at night. When the barracks fell into uneasy silence, whispers filled the dark. "I don't get it," one recruit said softly. "I thought he'd be gone by now." Another replied, "It doesn't make sense. He's old. He shouldn't even be able to keep up with us." But he did. And not only did he keep up, he seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Not in muscle, not in speed, but in presence. His silence became heavier. His endurance became louder than the recruits' shouts. One evening, after a brutal day of drills, the recruits sat together, their bodies sore and broken. The old man sat nearby, alone, as always, quietly mending a tear in his sleeve. One of the younger recruits finally spoke up, his voice low, but filled with reluctant respect. "That guy, he's different. He doesn't quit. He doesn't complain. Not once." His friend laughed nervously, trying to hide his own doubt. Maybe he's too stubborn to die. But deep down, they both knew it was more than stubbornness. It was something they couldn't name. The truth was, the old man carried something inside him that none of them had. His endurance wasn't just physical. It was born of experience, of battles fought long before these recruits were even born. He had already faced storms greater than this training. Pain and exhaustion were nothing new to him. That was why he endured while others broke. Still, the recruits clung to their pride. They continued mocking him, though their voices grew softer, their jokes less certain. For every insult they threw, the old man's silence answered louder. For every laugh they forced, his steady endurance reminded them of their own weakness. By now, some of the recruits were beginning to suspect there was more to this man than met the eye. No ordinary old man could last this long in such brutal training. No ordinary man could endure ridicule, exhaustion, and endless punishment without breaking. There was a weight in his silence, a truth hidden behind it. They just didn't know what it was yet. And so, the old man remained. Day after day, step after step, rep after rep. Quiet, enduring, unshaken. The recruits mocked. They doubted. They whispered. He stayed. He endured. He lasted. What they didn't realize was that this was only the surface of who he really was. His endurance was just the beginning of the truth. Soon, they would see something that would change everything. Soon, they would learn why this silent old man belonged here more than any of them. And it all began with a tattoo. Asterisk, the days dragged on at the SEAL training compound. Each one harder than the last. The young recruits were battered by endless running, freezing water drills, mud crawls, and sleepless nights. Their bodies ached, their spirits wavered, and some had already dropped out, unable to handle the unrelenting pressure. But through it all, the old man remained. He was mocked less openly now, though whispers still followed him. The recruits could not deny that he had lasted longer than many of their stronger, younger brothers. But still, in their hearts, they believed he didn't truly belong. He was too old, too frail. Sooner or later, they told themselves, his body would fail him. That moment almost came one morning during the grueling log carry exercise. Each team of recruits was forced to carry heavy wooden logs on their shoulders, running up and down the compound field under the scorching sun. The old man had been placed at the far end of a group, his narrow shoulders pressed under the weight of the log. At first, the recruits laughed. "Careful, Grandpa. That log's heavier than you are." One shouted, the others grinned, waiting for him to collapse. His knees bent slightly, his step slow, but he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, his face calm but his body trembling under the pressure. The group grew frustrated. His slower pace forced them all to adjust. Sweat poured down their faces as they shouted at him. "Move faster. You're holding us back. Drop out already." For the first time, the old man's body seemed close to breaking. His legs shook, his breaths came in sharp bursts, and the log dug cruelly into his skin. The recruits sneered, certain they were about to see him fail at last. And then it happened. As the group reached the end of the field, the old man adjusted his grip. His sleeve rolled up slightly, pushed back by the pressure of the log. A recruit at his side glanced at his arm and froze. There, etched into the old man's skin, was a faded tattoo. Not just any tattoo. It was the insignia of an elite SEAL unit, a mark worn only by men who had endured the most secret and dangerous missions in history. Asterisk, the recruit's breath caught in his throat. His laughter died instantly. He stared at the ink, the rough lines, weathered by time, burned into the old man's skin like a scar from another life. "Hey," the recruit whispered hoarsely, nudging the man next to him. "Look at his arm." Another recruit saw it, then another. The laughter stopped. Mocking ended. One by one, their eyes widened as the truth spread silently through the group. The old man wasn't just some stranger. He wasn't a lost soul clinging foolishly to youth. He was one of them. He had been one of them long before any of these recruits had even dreamed of joining. The tattoo spoke louder than any story could. It told of missions fought in silence, of sacrifices made in shadows, of battles that never made the news. It was a mark of honor, of survival, of belonging to a brotherhood few would ever understand. The old man said nothing. He didn't show the tattoo deliberately. It was revealed by accident, a glimpse of the truth he had carried quietly all along. But once seen, it could not be unseen. The recruits' faces turned pale. Their insults turned to silence. The weight of shame pressed heavier than the log on their shoulders. Every cruel word they had thrown at him now echoed in their minds like thunder. They had ridiculed a man who had already walked paths far darker and harder than any of them could imagine. When the exercise ended, the old man quietly lowered the log and stood straight. His sleeve slipped back down, hiding the tattoo again. He looked at no one. He spoke no words, but his silence was no longer mocked. Now it commanded respect. The recruits stole glances at him, their hearts pounding, the questions in their minds burned hotter than the sun overhead. Who was he really? What missions had he fought? What had those eyes seen? None of them dared to ask, but the tattoo had answered more than words ever could. For the rest of that day, the compound was quieter. The recruits still grunted, shouted, and pushed themselves through drills, but the old man's presence felt different now. He was no longer just the black, silent old man they had ridiculed. He was something else, something greater. That night, in the dim barracks, the whispers returned, but they were not mocking now. They were heavy with awe and guilt. "Did you see it?" One recruit asked in a hushed voice. "That tattoo. It's real." Another nodded slowly, his pride broken. "We laughed at him. We called him weak, and he's a legend." The truth had broken through their arrogance. The breaking point had come not for the old man, but for the recruits themselves. Their laughter was broken. Their pride was broken. And in its place, respect was slowly beginning to grow. The old man, as always, remained silent, He didn't reveal his past. He didn't lecture them or boast about his service. He simply continued training, his presence heavier now than ever before. The recruits had seen the tattoo. And with that, everything had changed. Asterisk, the compound felt different after that day. The tattoo had been seen, and though no words were spoken, by the old man, his silence now carried a weight that none of the recruits could ignore. The laughter that once followed him had died. Where there had been mocking voices, now there was only whispering in the barracks when the lights dimmed, and the recruits lay on their bunks with sore muscles and heavy eyes. The whispers grew louder. "You saw it too, right?" One muttered. "Yeah," another answered. "I know that symbol. My brother told me about it once." A third voice joined softly. "It's not just any tattoo. That mark belongs to one of the most elite SEAL units. Men who go on missions nobody talks about. Missions that don't even make the news." The younger recruits fell silent after that. Their hearts raced as they realized the truth. The old man they had ridiculed wasn't just some lost, weak fool. He was a man who had already worn the uniform they dreamed of wearing. He had already lived the life they were struggling so hard to earn. The next morning, the old man lined up. As usual, his face remained calm, his silence unbroken, his steps steady. But when the recruits looked at him now, their eyes no longer carried mockery. They carried shame, curiosity, and slowly, respect. During drills, no one dared to throw jokes his way. No one bumped his shoulder or tried to push him aside. Instead, they watched him quietly. Every movement he made, every step he took, carried a new meaning. His silence was no longer emptiness, was power. The instructors noticed the shift. They still said nothing, but the faintest of smiles tugged at one instructor's lips as he watched the recruits change a behavior. The lesson was being learned, though no words had been spoken. By lunchtime, the whispers turned into hushed conversations. "Do you think he fought in the Middle East?" one asked. "Maybe Iraq." "Afghanistan." Another shook his head. "That? Tattoos older than that. My uncle said it belonged to men who went into places nobody knew about. Places that were never written in history books." The third lowered his voice. "You think? You think he killed people?" The question hung heavy in the air. No one answered. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Men with that tattoo didn't just fight battles. They survived them. They carried ghosts. That night, while others slept, one recruit lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every cruel word he had spoken to the old man, every laugh, every insult. His stomach twisted with guilt. He whispered into the darkness, "We mocked him. And all this time, he was more of a soldier than any of us." The guilt spread through them all. But it wasn't just guilt, was awe. They had seen something rare, something sacred. That faded tattoo was a silent story of courage, of sacrifice, of pain endured for the sake of others. Days passed, and the old man remained the same. He didn't change his pace, didn't change his silence. He didn't reveal anything more about himself, but the recruits began to change. They no longer mocked him. Instead, they watched him, studying his quiet strength. Some began to copy him without even realizing it. They started pacing themselves during runs, learning that endurance mattered more than speed. They began to work with steadiness instead of rushing for attention. They began to understand that silence, too, could be a weapon. One day, during a grueling ocean drill, the recruits were ordered to plunge into the freezing water and tread for what felt like hours. Many panicked, thrashing against the waves. The old man slipped into the water with calm control, his face expressionless as the icy tide crashed around him. He didn't thrash, didn't fight the water. He floated, steady, enduring, conserving his energy. Slowly, the younger recruits tried to mimic him. They realized his way was the smarter way, the way of survival. After the drill, one recruit finally dared to speak to him. His voice was hesitant, almost trembling. "Sir, were you really SEAL?" The old man looked at him, his eyes calm but piercing. He said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't deny it. He simply turned away, his silence once again saying more than words ever could. The recruits swallowed hard. That non-answer was enough. Silence confirmed what they already knew. From then on, the recruits began to treat him differently. They no longer saw him as a frail stranger. They saw him as a mirror of what they hoped to become, a living example of the strength they wished to earn. The revelation spread beyond the compound. Rumors reached even the instructors' offices. Some of the recruits whispered that they were training alongside a legend, a ghost of the past who had returned not to prove himself, but to remind them what it truly meant to endure. Every scar, every wrinkle on his face, every silent step he took now, it all made sense. This was not a man running from age. This was a man who had already given his youth. 2 battles far darker than any training could prepare them for. The recruits began to realize the truth. The old man wasn't here to become a SEAL. He was here to teach them without ever speaking a word. And that was the true revelation. The days at the SEAL training compound grew heavier. Muscles ached, bones screamed, and every morning felt like waking into another battle. Yet in the middle of all the shouting, the commands, and the suffering, there was still one figure who never raised his voice, never answered back, never sought attention: the old man. By now, the recruits had stopped mocking him. The tattoo had silenced their laughter and replaced it with something deeper: curiosity, shame, and respect. But the silence of the old man remained a mystery they could not ignore. It wasn't just that he spoke little. It was the way he carried silence, like it was a shield. Or perhaps even a burden. One evening, after a long day of brutal sand drills, the recruits sat together, exhausted, their bodies caked with mud. The old man sat alone at the edge of the field, cleaning his boots slowly, methodically, his face calm as always. A young recruit finally spoke in a low voice, almost afraid to break the quiet. "Why doesn't he talk?" "Not once, not a word." Another shrugged. "Maybe he's just stubborn." "No," said a third, shaking his head. "That's not it. You can see it in his eyes. He's not silent because he has nothing to say. He's silent because he's already said it all in his life. He's lived more than we can imagine." The words sank into the group. They all turned to look at the old man again. His silence wasn't empty, was full. Like a deep ocean holding stories beneath its surface, the instructors noticed too. Sometimes during training, the drill sergeant's eyes would linger on the old man for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, respect, the kind of respect only a warrior could give another warrior. The recruits began to see it more clearly each day. His silence was not weakness, it was discipline. He didn't waste breath on words because he had learned long ago that words could not win battles. Actions did. Endurance did. Quiet strength did. During one night drill, when the recruits were forced to crawl through freezing mud under barbed wire, many of them cried out in pain, cursed loudly, or begged for mercy. But the old man said nothing. His lips were tight, his body trembling, but he pulled himself forward, inch by inch. Not a groan, not a curse, not a plea for relief. Just silence. Watching him, some recruits began to push harder themselves. His example showed them something they had never learned in books or lectures. True strength was not in noise. True strength was not in shouting louder than others. True strength was in the will to endure quietly, to let the body scream while the spirit stayed calm. The silence of the old man began to spread among them. Slowly, the barracks grew quieter at night. The mocking voices were gone, replaced with quiet reflection. The young men, once loud with arrogance, now carried themselves differently. They watched the old man closely, and though he never instructed them, they were learning from him. One afternoon, during a rare break, a brave recruit finally approached him. His voice shook as he asked, "Sir, why do you stay so quiet?" The old man looked at him, his eyes deep and unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the recruit thought he would be ignored. But then the old man gave the faintest of smiles. Not a happy smile, but a sad one, filled with memories. And then, in a voice rough like gravel, he spoke for the first time, "Because I've seen what noise brings." The recruit froze. The old man's words were few, but they hit harder than any shout. The old man didn't explain further, didn't tell stories of war or glory. He simply turned his gaze back to the ground, and once again, the silence returned. That single sentence, however, was enough. The recruits understood. Noise was for the untested, for those who needed to prove themselves. Silence was for those who had already walked through hell. For those who had seen enough pain and death to know that words could never capture it. The old man's silence was not. Emptiness was remembrance. Every quiet moment carried the weight of fallen brothers, of missions that haunted his nights, of sacrifices that could never be spoken aloud. His silence was respect for the dead, for the life he once lived, for the ghosts that followed him. From then on, the recruits no longer questioned his silence. They began to carry some of it themselves. When the pain of training grew unbearable, they no longer shouted or cursed. They clenched their jaws, endured quietly, and pushed forward. In this way, the old man had taught them a lesson no instructor could ever put into words. The revelation spread quietly among them. Silence was not weakness. Silence was strength. Silence was discipline. Silence was the mark of a true warrior. And so, the compound grew quieter. Not because the drills lessened, but because the recruits were slowly learning the power of endurance. The old man never lectured, never commanded, never boasted. Without speaking, he had begun to change them all. The Navy SEAL training compound had changed. It wasn't the drills or the punishments that grew different. Those remained just as brutal, if not worse. What changed was the way the recruits saw the old man. Where once they saw weakness, now they saw something else. Where once there had been laughter, now there was silence. Where once there had been mockery, now there was respect. The shift was not sudden. Respect does not come in an instant. It comes slowly, like dawn creeping over the horizon, soft but undeniable. The recruits began to notice things they had once ignored. The old man's posture, always upright despite the pain. The way he never complained, no matter how harsh the drill. The way he endured each punishment as though he had already endured. Far worse. During a long-distance run one morning, a young recruit fell behind, his legs heavy, his lungs burning. He stumbled, ready to collapse. But before he hit the ground, the old man was there beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't scold. He simply placed a steady hand on the recruit's back and ran beside him, his slow but consistent pace keeping the younger man moving until they reached the finish line. The recruit, gasping for air, whispered, "Thank you, sir." The old man gave no reply, only a small nod. Yet that simple act echoed louder in the young man's heart than any word of encouragement. Others began to notice. And soon, more recruits found themselves drawn to his quiet strength. When they were near him, they felt steadier. When they watched him endure, they felt braver. His silence was no longer confusing. It was comforting. One day, during a freezing water drill, the recruits were ordered to plunge into the ocean and remain there, arms linked as waves crashed over them. The water bit into their skin like knives, stealing their breath, numbing their limbs. Many cried out, some cursed, others begged for the drill to end. But the old man, in the center of the line, said nothing. His face was calm, his body stiff. Against the cold, his eyes staring straight ahead. One by one, the recruits beside him began to quiet down. They clenched their jaws, forced their bodies to still, and copied him. They endured. In that moment, the old man was no longer just enduring for himself, he was teaching them to endure too. The instructors noticed. They didn't say a word. But their eyes revealed something reapproval. They had seen countless young men try and fail. But this old man, with nothing left to prove, was reshaping the very spirit of the group without ever shouting a single order. Soon, the recruits stopped calling him old man behind his back. They didn't know his name, but they began to call him sir out of instinct. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. Respect had replaced ridicule. In the barracks at night, the whispers were no longer cruel jokes. They were stories, guesses about where he had served, which missions he had fought, how many scars were hidden beneath his skin. No one laughed anymore. Instead, they spoke with awe, with curiosity, with admiration. One evening, as the recruits sat around, too tired to move, one of them said quietly, "You know, I used to think he was just in the way. I thought he was weak, but now I think he's stronger than all of us." No one argued, no one mocked. They all knew it was true. Respect began to show in their actions. When the old man carried a heavy log during drills, no one shouted at him anymore. Instead, they adjusted their steps to match his pace. When he sat alone at meals, recruits began sitting near him, quietly, without disturbing his silence. When he ran, those who had once sprinted ahead now chose to match his steady rhythm. Learning that consistency outlasted speed. The transformation was clear. The old man had become their unspoken leader. Not by rank, not by orders, but by example. One afternoon, during a brutal set of push-ups under the scorching sun, a recruit collapsed, too weak to continue. The instructor shouted, but the young man couldn't rise. The old man moved beside him, lowered himself to the ground, and began doing push-ups at the same slow pace as the fallen recruit. Without a word, he encouraged him to rise again, to continue. And the recruit did. The others watched in silence, their respect deepening further. By the end of the week, the recruits no longer saw him as the black, silent old man. To them, he was proof of what they hoped to become: men of discipline, men of endurance, men who carried strength without needing to boast. And though he never sought their admiration, he had earned it. Every drop of sweat, every silent step, every scar hidden beneath his skin had spoken for him. They didn't need stories. They didn't need explanations. His presence alone was enough. The old man never asked for respect, but in the end, he received it anyway. Not because he demanded it, but because he deserved it. The training compound was quieter now. Not because the drills had grown easier if anything, they were harder than ever, but because the recruits themselves had changed. The laughter, the arrogance, the mocking voices that once filled the air were gone. In their place was discipline, humility, and respect. And at the center of this transformation stood the old man. He had not given them speeches. He had not told them his story. He had not demanded respect or lectured them on their behavior. All he had done was endure silently, steadily, without pride and without complaint. Yet his silence had become their greatest teacher by now. The recruits no longer measured themselves by who could run the fastest or shout the loudest. They began to measure themselves by endurance, by who could last, who could push through pain without breaking. He realized that strength wasn't in showing off, was in surviving. In pushing forward even when the body screamed for rest. One morning, during a brutal march with heavy packs strapped to their backs, a recruit stumbled and nearly fell. Before the instructors could bark at him, two other recruits rushed to his side and lifted part of his load. They didn't laugh at him, didn't call him weak. Instead, they shared his burden. It was a quiet act, and they all knew where they had learned it from watching the old man. The instructors noticed the change. They had seen many groups of recruits before, and they knew this one was different. Something had shifted in their spirit. They were no longer competing only for themselves. They had begun to act like brothers. That evening, after a long day, the recruits sat together near the barracks. For the first time, the old man did not sit apart. Slowly, one of the younger recruits walked over and sat beside him. Then another, and another. Soon, the old man was surrounded not by mockery, but by quiet respect. They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand stories about his past. They simply sat near him, as if his presence alone gave them strength. The silence they once mocked had become something they wanted to share. One recruit finally spoke, his voice soft. "Sir, we owe you an apology, all of us." The old man looked at him, his face unreadable. The recruit lowered his head. "We mocked you. We called you weak, but we were wrong. You've shown us what real strength is. We'll never forget it." For a long moment, the old man said nothing. Then, for only the second time since his arrival, he spoke. His voice was rough, deep and heavy with age and memory. "Words mean little," he said. "What matters is what you do when no one is watching. What matters is how long you can keep going when everything in you wants to quit. That's what makes a man. That's what makes a soldier." The recruits listened in silence, every word carving itself into their hearts. He didn't give them a speech about honor or glory. He didn't talk about medals or victories. He gave them something far greater, the truth. After that night, they understood him completely. His silence had never been weakness. It had been discipline. It had been respect for the battles he had fought, for the brothers he had lost, for the life he had lived. His silence was the mark of a man who had seen enough of war to know that true strength did not need to shout. The next day, when training resumed, something remarkable happened. The recruits began working together in perfect rhythm. They carried logs without complaint, sharing the weight equally. They endured freezing water without cries of pain. They ran as a unit, no longer racing each other, but matching their pace as one. And always, at the center of it, was the old man. He did not command them. He did not lead with orders, but they followed him anyway. His steady steps, his calm presence, his quiet strength guided them more than any loud command could. Weeks later, when training ended and the recruits prepared to move on, the old man was still there, silent as ever. He did not congratulate them. He did not say goodbye. He simply stood among them, the same as on the first day. But everything had changed. Where once he had been the subject of ridicule, now he was the symbol of what they wanted to become. Where once they had seen only an old man, now they saw a warrior, a teacher, a legend. The recruits never learned his full story. They never asked about the missions he had fought or the sacrifices he had made. They didn't need to. The tattoo, the scars, and the silence had told them everything they needed to know. When they left the compound, each recruit carried a piece of his lesson with them. They carried the understanding that strength was not noise. Strength was not arrogance. Strength was not mocking others. Strength was endurance. Strength was silence. Strength was respect, and though the old man never asked to be remembered, they would never forget him. For the rest of their lives, whenever they faced moments of pain, doubt, or fear, they would remember the silent old man at the SEAL training. Compound the man they had ridiculed the man they had underestimated, and the man who had taught them the greatest lesson of all. Never judge what you do not understand, and never mistake silence for weakness. True warriors speak not with words, but with the endurance of their spirit.